Welcome everyone to our weekly webinar for the CMALT CMOOC, and for any of our guests watching from the Escalate Mobile Learning Special Interest Group and the SOTL Research Cluster, welcome. And we hope to just really discuss some of the issues around the area of a CMALT portfolio to do with the wider context. So that's the area that we're discussing tonight. And with me tonight we have all the way from Nelson. You can see out the window there in the background. Sunny Nelson is Paul Devine from NMIT, Nelson Marlborough Institute of Technology. So thanks for joining us, Paul.
My pleasure. Hi, everyone.
And hopefully Ian from Coventry will join us. He did say he was going to, but he might have got lost in the traffic or something. And of course, it's a long weekend here in New Zealand, and so unfortunately, a lot of our normal participants are off on holiday already. So that's okay.
Just the
yeah, so Paul and I are just going to have a discussion tonight about the wider context and what does that mean and what do you do with it for your portfolio. So we're just going to have a bit of fun. Hopefully you enjoy our banter. So I'm just going to go into screen sharing just to show you where we're at for week 4 in the Google Plus community. So here we go, start screen sharing. Right, so here we are in Google Plus, and you can see week 4, exploring the wider context. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's really about sort of policy and legislation, whether that be institutional, or it could be governmental, it could be, you know, big cultural issues for that are specific to your context, things that impact teaching and learning in your context, and how do they impact what you do in the context of teaching and learning, particularly with educational technology. So there's two really key parts. There is policy and legislation. So policy could be, you know, technical standards, could be professional codes of practice. So if, say, you're a journalism lecturer, what are some of the key elements of you know, the journalism profession, or, you know, whatever profession it is perhaps that you're is in your context? Are there some particular professional codes of practice that would really impact teaching and learning in your context or not? In the context of New Zealand, we have the tertiary education strategy, which is sort of really coming to an end because we have a new government, but it's still in play, the current one. And it really looks at 3 main issues: is economics, environmental outcomes, and social outcomes, and how they really influence government funding, what we want out of education, what's the point, and, you know, how does tertiary education help New Zealand in the world stage. Another key one, I think, for New Zealand in particular would be exploring things like the Treaty of Waitangi. How does the treaty really impact teaching and learning in your context? What are issues around biculturalism? How do we make sure that we're being fair to minority learners or Indigenous learners, etc.? And so thinking through those contexts, and that obviously is going to be very dependent upon your country and the culture that you're in. So that will be different for every country. So I guess this is really a key part of the portfolio, where you really contextualize it for your context and really get to grips with some of those local, international, national, institutional sort of pressure points. So they can be biggies, but you know, I think it's really worth sort of exploring those and reflecting on them, and really sort of looking through what are those things that perhaps you've had to really deal with, that you've had to grapple with. They can be really positive as well. So it's not to say that these are negative, but it's just that they have impact on the teaching and learning. So that's what today's sort of big topic is. And you can see there's been a little bit of activity in the Google Plus community. a bit of sharing of some people's content, which is great. We've had Vanessa share a video, and I shared a post just recently on from Sage Publishing on why should I use OrcID, which has nothing to do with the Lord of the Rings. OrcID is the Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier, and they've got a really nice article from Sage Publishing on why would you use OrcID and what's it all about. And really, it's about kind of consolidating your research profile and getting credit for your work. And it's an open platform to be able to do that. It's not owned by any publishing company, which is great. So Sage is just sort of introducing it to people, which is good. So there we go. I mean, what are some of the things perhaps specific to NMIT that you think you might discuss, Paul? I'm just going to stop the screen sharing. We'll go back to discussion.
Well, there's a couple of things I can think of. One of them is use of social media, and
so that's a big issue at NMIT?
Not so much unless it's used in a course or teaching and learning context. I guess, you know, for example, we, for our arts and media courses, have started to set up WordPress blogs, which we host. And that was kind of one of the things we had to work through. You know, what happens if somebody posts something,
so it's just trying to work out appropriate use guidelines, acceptable use guidelines, that sort of thing?
Yes, yeah. And I guess there's a lot of nervousness about it. Probably me, actually, was quite nervous. You know, what's going to happen if a student does something? And, you know, in the finish, we decided to trust the students. You know, we've had trouble in the past, even with Moodle forums. You get, you know, occasionally you get a person that's starts posting kind of sort of inappropriate stuff online, but it's kind of internal. You can deal with it internally, but
yeah,
if somebody starts.
So WordPress is a bit more public facing, and
yeah, and it's kind of attached to NMIT, but it's very public.
Yeah,
could be very public, but that's been going all year, and I'm not aware of any issues at all, and I think it's pretty successful. So
great. And have you done any evaluation with the lecturers and students? What's their feedback on it so far?
Kind of anecdotal feedback is really good, but we haven't done a formal review yet. So
my cough coming back.
I haven't been directly involved, so I'm just kind of a bystander and have just kind of watched it from the side as a bit involved in setting it up. What are the things we should worry about? So those are my things about legislation. It's things about privacy. It's about students' data, and it's kind of how do we protect students from other students, or how do we protect students from themselves, maybe putting on some sort of public face. But they can do that anyway, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess it's been a real big issue this year, particularly in Europe and UK, around data protection and ownership of data, and you know, the big breaches through Facebook and other social media, which really led them to sort of legislate about you know, data protection. So their general data protection, I can't even remember what they call it now, but they have that legislation that's all live. And so you might have noticed every time you go to a website now, pretty much a window pops up and says, we use cookies, do you accept them? Or this is our privacy policy, do you accept it, etc. And so that's really sort of made issues around data privacy and policy quite explicit on the web, because Europe, you know, really sort of pushed that through. We don't have that in New Zealand.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some other things I've been thinking about. I saw a couple of presentations at the Tertiary ICT conference in Christchurch a couple of weeks ago about use of facial recognition software and
Do you have that
AI.
on campus?
Pardon?
Do you have that anywhere on campus at the moment? Facial recognition software?
No, no. Not as far as I know.
Maybe in your office and you don't know.
Yeah, but I saw a couple of presentations. One in particular was kind of a research project, and they were using facial recognition to actually measure in real time the emotions of the students in class.
Okay, why?
Well, ostensibly it was to give tutors or lecturers kind of like real-time feedback
Okay.
on the mood of the students as
That's kind of interesting. So you'd have to be looking at a screen to get the data from the facial recognition from the students, see if they're falling asleep or not, or during a lecture. And
they can actually watch it later on.
I think it's normally pretty obvious when your students fall asleep in class, but
yeah, but it kind of was an interesting experiment. Well, it was actually quite an interesting experiment, and maybe there are other kind of uses for it.
Yeah.
But the tester was these two researchers. I think they know each other privately, and they had a family get together, and they had the camera on during the family get together, and they announced what they were doing. And it showed a graph of all of the emotions on display at the family get together, and how the happiness level went up while they were kind of describing their project, their research project. As people got excited about it, and their kind of corners of their mouth went up, and whatever the other things are, and then there's a sudden dip as the happiness level went down. And sort of what happened there? Well, he said, "Oh, that's when I told a joke about my wife."
Yeah.
But that does raise some questions about the potential of, to me, the potential of AI and how intrusive that could be, because cameras on campus could actually track maybe the mood of a student over time, of an individual student over time. And so somebody is kind of maybe falling into depression, or they're getting behind in their coursework or whatever. To think that's actually at least theoretically possible to do that.
Yeah. I guess you need some sort of guidelines and legislation, before the technology, goes wild, I suppose. So it's good to think through those issues.
I think possibly what's happening is the cameras are being put in to count students.
Yeah.
And then by flicking a switch, suddenly you can track their emotions, identify individual students individually rather than just counting students.
Yeah.
Very easy. So that's something that's going to have to be grappled with at some point.
Yeah, probably another sort of, I'm not sure if it's policy or legislation that might be relevant to Polytechs in New Zealand in particular, and NMIT, is that TANS, sort of the agreement with TANS, and how does that sort of impact what you do locally, and how you relate to the other Polytechs in the sector, etc.
Well, I think there are some issues in terms of things like how, this is not my area at all, but how certain grades, so somebody might be given a discretionary pass or something, or they might be...
Yeah, so there's common papers between the Polytechs and using the same content, and you're meaning are they grading them equitably between the different?
Yeah, I think over time, different sort of policies have developed over what happens to a student who just narrowly fails, and their criteria for them to, you know, and different ways of denoting that in the various student management systems. And I think TANS has come up with a common policy, but because all the other institutes have been doing it so differently.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that's probably something worth really thinking about. Is, you know, if you are sharing content and courses and academics between institutions, yeah, what are the policies around it, making it equitable and making sure everyone's getting a fair deal and being assessed in the same manner, etc.
Yeah. So that's probably a good process to go through. I think that's maybe going to be painful
yeah.
for people, and people who you manage those systems and things like that. But the idea of having some kind of standard, I think is good, and also it tends, because it's fully. If I'm thinking about the eCampus project, because they're fully online, they're coming up with guidelines and things on how to run a fully online course, so they have sort of standards that we might not have in the various partner institutes.
Right.
And so I think that's going to be good. We're going to learn from them.
Cool. So I think part of the key with the section of the CMALT portfolio, like all the sections really, is trying to choose something that's relevant to you. So make it relevant to your institution, to your teaching practice, and really sort of thrash about the what's the impact of different policies and legislation. Of course, the key thing is always reflecting back on how does this impact your learners. So it's about the teaching and learning of it, not just the technology by itself. Hey, so thanks, Paul, for joining us and having a bit of a chat. And obviously everyone's headed off for the long weekend early, but hopefully we get to catch up with them next week in week 5.
Oh.
Yeah, week 5 webinar. So we'll look forward to that. And
all right, Tom.
look forward to everyone's posts on the Google Plus and on the Project Bank and all the stuff they're going to be sharing. So it'll be awesome.
Okay.
Hey, well, thanks, Paul.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Yeah.
Sign off there.